I have the greatest subscriber base in the world because Mike Mafia currently wants me to begin making fantasy football content. So I figured the best way to dip my toes into the waters of fantasy football content was to make a video on fantasy football players that you absolutely need to have on your team in order to be successful this year. Now, these are going to be players in almost every round of the NFL draft, of your fantasy football draft, and we're going to be doing this via the best ball ADP provided to us from Underdog Fantasy because, well, the good guys at Underdog Fantasy are sponsoring this video. Now, if you guys want to see more content like this, if you want fantasy football to have a presence on my channel, make sure you sack that like button for the YouTube algorithm. This is a brand new series that we're debuting, and of course, if it succeeds, then obviously it communicates to me that you guys want to see more of it, and therefore I will create more fantasy football content. Last year I made one video and it seemed like you guys didn't really like it, so I kind of stepped away from it, but I'm gonna keep trying each and every year just in case if my subscribers want something different. Now that we get all that out of the way, break! Now guys, here's the really cool part of this video being sponsored. I am currently creating 3 drafts, so you guys could draft with me on Underdog Fantasy's website. If you use my promo code Mikerophone, I'm gonna be choosing 33 of you guys to draft with me in private drafts on Underdog Fantasy. Make sure you join my Discord once you do it, so that way we have a means of talking on Discord as we're drafting. I figured this is probably the coolest sponsorship ever because we have a means of actually doing a fantasy football draft together, and I felt like you guys would absolutely love it. If there's a lot more people that sign up, I'm capable of doing more private drafts, so just let me know on Discord or hit me up on Twitter or hit me up in my Instagram DMs once it's done. I'm gonna try to get as many of you guys in as I possibly can. And of course, my promo code is Mikerophone. Very important that you use that promo code so you can get a free $25 on Underdog's website. Now, since I'm a fairly busy guy, yet I love playing fantasy football, the way I'm going to be doing this is via Underdog Fantasy's ADP, and that's because I personally don't want to worry about waiver wire claims and setting my lineups. And the way the best ball method works is Underdog automatically selects the best player on your team, sets your lineup for you, so that way if Odell Beckham Jr. happens to only score 3 points that week and you have CeeDee Lamb that went off for 40 but he was technically on your bench, well, CeeDee Lamb would automatically start for you. And I'm just doing it this way because I know you guys are probably busy. I'm personally very busy myself, but for the most part, the ADP translates to each and every fantasy football league, as you're going to see right now. And the first player that I think is a must-have on each and every fantasy football team is Saquon Barkley. And the reason for this is obviously it's going to be a little different if you're drafting within the top 5 of your fantasy football draft. Then I kind of understand why you wouldn't want to reach for Saquon Barkley, but currently, according to Underdog Fantasy, Saquon Barkley currently has an ADP of a 10.9. ADP obviously stands for average draft position, guys, if you guys didn't know that. That is extremely low for a player that was going in the top 3 of previous fantasy football drafts. Now, you might be thinking, hey, Saquon Barkley is coming off of an ACL tear. Yes, I do understand that, and I guess I might be a little bit impartial because, one, Saquon Barkley doesn't have a lot of mileage on him. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's only played 2 full seasons in the NFL. You're talking about a guy that only has a carry count of 497 carries, and if you consider all the offseason additions and the improvements that the New York Giants made, Saquon Barkley is an absolute steal at his current ADP. And honestly, I might be a little biased because I saw what Adrian Peterson did coming off of an ACL tear, and when you combine that with the fact that Saquon Barkley is relatively young and the New York Giants made several additions that should potentially open up the running game for them, well, I think Saquon is just a remarkable get in your first round, especially if you're drafting from the 5 to 8 range. Up next, we have Darren Waller, probably one of my favorite tight ends in the NFL this year. Last year, Darren Waller was practically unstoppable. He had 5 games of 100 receiving yards or more, and his weekly ceiling is very close to that of Travis Kelce, whose current ADP is at a 6.5. Well, according to Underdog Fantasy, you could get Darren Waller at pick number 22, and the number one concern with Darren Waller is primarily the fact that he is in a very run-heavy offense. Over the last 2 seasons, the the Las Vegas Raiders have ranked 11th in rushing attempts and 21st in passing attempts, according to Pro Football Reference. But Darren Waller is an absolute target machine. There was one particular game last year against the New York Jets in Week 12 where Darren Waller had 13 receptions on 17 targets for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns and a 31-28 win. Outbursts like this can literally win you your fantasy football league, especially when you consider that there are some question marks after the top 3 tight ends in the draft. Even though Kyle Pitts and Mark Andrews are solid pickups, I wouldn't be as comfortable drafting Kyle Pitts or Mark Andrews as I would be drafting Darren Waller. Speaking of Kyle Pitts, let's talk about the number 1 wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons in Calvin Ridley. Last year, Calvin Ridley was absolutely dominant. Despite sharing targets with the likes of Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley was targeted 143 times and was able to come down with an insane 1,374 receiving yards and 9 touchdowns. Even before he was absolutely crushing it with receiving yards, in his rookie season he came down with 10 touchdowns, and his sophomore season he came down with 7. And obviously the logic here is fairly simple. Julio Jones recently got traded to the Tennessee Titans, and of course the Atlanta Falcons do have a brand new target in the number 4 pick in the NFL draft in Kyle Pitts, but as a result we can expect Calvin Ridley to get a significant amount of targets this year as a result of Julio Jones' departure. Historically, Ridley has always been a tremendous route runner, and he's entering his age 27 season, which is his 4th season in the NFL, which means that he's technically about to enter his prime. And when you consider the fact that his ADP is a 13.4, while he could be a great consolation prize in the event that you weren't able to snag a running back in the 2nd round, or if you're the final pick in your draft and you want to select another bona fide stud that is going to have a tremendous target share at the top of the 2nd round, then you definitely cannot go wrong with Calvin Ridley. Now, speaking of Julio Jones, he definitely needs to be added to this list because as a result of him switching teams, he's no longer a player that is typically selected within the first 2 rounds of the draft. As a matter of fact, Underdog currently has him at an ADP of a 39.2. Now, listen to this really quick. Julio Jones is currently ranked as the 18th best wide receiver in fantasy football drafts. So getting him in the 4th round is going to be an absolute steal. And obviously, yes, wide receivers are extremely deep this year. But if you're in a situation where you went running back in your first 2 rounds and now you need to fill holes at wide receiver, well, you're going to feel pretty damn good if you were able to get your 2 running backs and then were able to snag Julio Jones in the 4th round. Now, obviously, don't expect Atlanta Falcons-like dominance. However, I do believe the upside for him to be as dominant or even 80% as dominant as he was with the Atlanta Falcons to be there with the Tennessee Titans. Either way, you won't feel horrible about snagging Julio Jones in the 4th round. I think we could all agree on that. Now, you all know I'm a Dallas Cowboys fan, and I have just been eating up all of the hype around CeeDee Lamb, and maybe it's just my homerism. You could let me know in the comment section down below, but I'm all in on the CeeDee Lamb hype. I mean, if you looked at CeeDee Lamb at the beginning of 2020 with Dak Prescott, he seemed to have had remarkable chemistry, but what blew my mind is this is a guy that almost had 1,000 yards receiving while having the likes of Garrett Gilbert, Ben DiNucci, and Andy Dalton throwing him the football. So if you consider the fact that he did that in his rookie year, came down with 934 yards, 74 receptions, and 5 touchdowns off of 111 targets in an offense that was as predictable as the Dallas Cowboys record this year, 8-9. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a pessimist. Then you're gonna feel really good selecting CeeDee Lamb because I think he will emerge as the top wide receiver for the Dallas Cowboys. I'm expecting him to do something similar to what Chris Godwin did in 2019 and what Calvin Ridley did last year. And with a healthy Dak Prescott throwing him the football, with a reinvigorated Ezekiel Elliott rushing the football, and a pretty good offensive line, I'm expecting a fully healthy Dallas Cowboys offense to absolutely decimate opposing defenses this year. The best part is CeeDee Lamb's ADP is currently a 24.7. Up next, we have a running back, and that's Clyde EdwardsHelaire. Now, I was really big on Clyde last year, but obviously he didn't fulfill his potential. But I feel like a lot of that could be attributed to the fact that there was a pandemic offseason, the Kansas City Chiefs were coming off of a Super Bowl, and well, last year was just very weird in general. But the fact that you could snag a player like Clyde EdwardsHelaire with the 23rd pick in your draft is an absolute steal. This is a guy that I literally selected as a first-round pick last year, and historically, Kansas City Chiefs running backs haven't really let me down apart from Clyde EdwardsHelaire last year, but his entire season wasn't all that bad. Yes, he only had 5 touchdowns in general, but his yards per carry weren't necessarily that horrible with 4.4. I've seen rookies be way worse than that, and going into year 2 with this brand new Kansas City Chiefs offensive line, I'm expecting absolute greatness from Clyde, and the fact that he's now a player that you could get in your second round, then, well, I just can't pass up an opportunity to have an investment in the Kansas City Chiefs offense in the second round. Another running back that I believe is an absolute must-have is a player that could be had a little bit later in the NFL draft, and that's Javonte Williams, who currently has an ADP of a 69.2. The thing is, I understand that the Denver Broncos already have Melvin Gordon, and the reason I'm so big on Javonte Williams is anytime a team trades up in the second round of the NFL draft to select a player, well, that's a player that is clearly someone they absolutely love and a player that should probably be on your fantasy football roster. Melvin Gordon was also absent in voluntary OTAs, and the risk to reward ratio on taking a flyer on a player like this late in your fantasy football draft is just too great to ignore it. Another wide receiver that I think is a clear must-have in your best ball draft would be T. Higgins, and typically I would say go with Jamar Chase here, but the thing is, Jamar Chase's ADP is a 45.4. A lot of people are going to lean that way because he does have that chemistry with Joe Burrow from LSU, but reports are indicating that Jamar Chase is a little rusty as a result of taking a full year and a half off from playing football, and as a result, he hasn't been able to gain as much separation in training camp. Now, I don't know what you want to make of that report. Obviously, we've seen reports like this in the past, but if I'm going to have to choose between Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and they're being selected back to back from each other, then I'm going to be selecting the proven commodity, and that's T. Higgins. Higgins was targeted 108 times last year. He came down with 67 receptions and 908 receiving yards. He also came down with 6 touchdowns, and bear in mind, that's in his rookie season. If you also look at his frame and his body type, he does have the frame of the player that will be replacing the AJ Green, at least AJ Green in his prime in that role, where he's probably the most likely to be the red zone target that Joe Burrow is going to lean on, especially if there's familiarity between them two from last year. Jamar Chase is more of a home run type of player, and honestly, if it seems like he's already struggling to gain separation on the Cincinnati Bengals defensive backs, then I feel very cautious about selecting him, especially if you could have a proven commodity in T. Higgins. Now, if you're absolutely dominating your draft, then you absolutely have to take a flyer on a player like Michael Thomas, whose ADP is currently an 87. Now, I know what you might be thinking. There might be some turmoil between Michael Thomas and the Saints, but that was actually reported to be squashed. Sean Payton and Michael Thomas met together. They aired out their problems and everything's good to go. Michael Thomas should be back in November. So if you are absolutely crushing it in your league, he will be able to come back and give you a boost as you're making a playoff run. And honestly, it's really hard not to take a flyer on a star like Michael Thomas that's available at the 87th pick. It's not as big of a risk as you may think, and honestly, I think it could be the difference between winning your fantasy football league and losing your fantasy football league. And my final wide receiver that I do want to include on this list is none other than Will Fuller, mainly because Will Fuller is on a prove-it deal with the Miami Dolphins. The Miami Dolphins don't necessarily have a surefire #1 wide receiver. It could be between him and Jalen Waddle, and I understand how people would be leaning towards Jalen Waddle because there's already some familiarity with Tua Tagovailoa, but here's the thing. Historically, whenever there is a wide receiver on a prove-it deal in a brand new situation, just like Will Fuller's in, that's historically shown flashes of brilliance. Usually the wide receiver locks in and does whatever it takes to cash in the year after, and that's the situation that Will Fuller seems to be in. He's on a 1-year, $10 million contract with the Miami Dolphins that recently completely revamped their offense. It's all going to be dependent on Tua. Do you trust in his ability to potentially take the next step this year and break out as a star QB, or is he just going to be a check down artist and a game manager that the Miami Dolphins may have regretted taking the year prior. It all depends on Tua's development, but I'm willing to roll the dice on a wide receiver that historically has been very, very good for the Houston Texans, especially if his ADP is around the 85 range according to Underdog Fantasy. And my final must-have player that you should absolutely draft, especially if you're going to be doing Underdog Fantasy's best ball method, is Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson may not play this year, but he's showing up to practice and he's showing up to camp and he's running drills and he's engaging the media, and it seems like no matter what, he will be playing football this year. But I don't know which team he will be playing football for, but it's extremely atypical for a quarterback to be traded in the middle of the season. Offenses in the NFL are extremely complicated. You can't just have a quarterback go from one team to another in the middle of the season and lead that team to greatness. If Deshaun Watson does get traded at this point, it'll probably be at the conclusion of the season. So I'm expecting him to play, and you could have him for a crazy average draft position of 194. And that is definitely worth taking a flyer on, especially if this is a quarterback that, in my opinion, would have won MVP if his team was at least somewhat competent last year and if Aaron Rodgers wasn't an absolute maniac. But this is a QB that's typically drafted in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th round of fantasy football drafts, available for you at pick number 194. And if he doesn't play, then that's fine. But if you consider the fact that Sam Darnold, Zach Wilson, Kirk Cousins, and Trey Lance are ranked higher than him in ADP, then it's definitely worth taking a risk on Deshaun Watson. And that's going to be like my only quarterback for this list because this video is getting way too long. But if you guys want to see more fantasy football content, please let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, make sure you sign up with my promo code Mikerophone and tweet me, DM me on IG, or hit me up in Discord once you do it so we can make a private draft and draft together. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike, and I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.